Chapter 4. Sam Crawford. Samuel Earl Crawford, who prefers to be called Wahoo Sam, played Major League Baseball for 19 years from 1899 through 1917. He was fast. He typically stole 25 to 30 bases a season. He could hit. The record books credited him with 2,964 Major League hits, a figure exceeded by very few men in the history of baseball. And he could hit with power. He led the National League in home runs in 1901 and the American League in 1908 and 1914. In combination, these elements resulted in 312 Major League triples, still the most three baggers ever hit by one man. It is almost inconceivable that this record will ever be broken. Willie Mays, the closest approximation to a modern-day Sam Crawford, accumulated by 140 triples during his 22 seasons in the majors. Most baseball writers of that period agree that Sam Crawford was the outstanding power hitter of the dead ball era. H.G. Salsinger, eminent Detroit sports writer who covered the Detroit Tigers throughout the era of Ty Cobb and Sam Crawford, recalls that I have seen right fielders playing against the fence catch 5 fly balls off Crawford's bat in one game, 5 fly balls that would have cleared the fence any time after the season of 1920, when the jackrabbit ball was introduced. I don't know how you found me, but since you're here, you might as well come in and sit down. I don't have much time, though. Got a lot of things to do. But it's a hot day, so come on in and rest a while. Yeah, I'm sort of hard to find. Still bounce around a lot, you know. Always on the move. Probably a hangover from all those years in baseball. Boston today, Detroit tomorrow. Never long in one place. I do have a house down in Hollywood, but I can't take that town. Too much smog, too many cars, all fouling up the air. Can hardly breathe down there. Too many people, too. Have to stand in line everywhere you go. Can't even get a loaf of bread without standing in line. Pretty soon they'll be standing in line to get into the John. That's not for me. No, I don't have a telephone. If I had a lot of money, I wouldn't even have one. I never was for telephones. Just don't like them. That's all. Anybody wants to talk to you, they come to see you. I do have a television over there. It was a gift, but I'd never turned it on. I'd rather read a book. Don't even watch the ball games. Oh, maybe the World Series, but that's about it. I like to do what I like to do. That's all. I don't see why I should watch television just because everybody else does. I'd rather read a book or fix up the garden or just take a walk with my wife Mary and see what's going on, you know. Heck, I don't even buy a newspaper. Nothing but trouble in it. Just spoils your day. You get up in the morning, feel pretty good, get a hold of a paper, and what do you see? Nothing but trouble. Big headlines about bombs and a war and misery. It ruins the day. That's the way I look at it, anyway. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. So you're doing a book about baseball in the old days, huh? Why does a young fellow like you want to spend his time on something like that? Do you remember that Robert Ingersoll used to say, "Let the dead past bury its dead"? But that's what he used to say. Robert Ingersoll, remember him? Great man. I always admired him. He was a very famous lecturer in the late 1800s. Very famous and very controversial. He was supposed to be an atheist, but he wasn't really. More skeptic, more agnostic than an atheist. You should read his lectures sometime. Very interesting. Now he's forgotten. Hardly anybody even remembers his name anymore. That probably proves something, but I'm not sure what. Anyway, those days are all back in the past. We're going to spend the rest of our lives in the future, not in the past. Let the dead past bury its dead. On the other hand, Santa Ana has said, those who forgot the past are condemned to repeat it. So maybe there are two sides to this matter, but I don't think we'll ever repeat the old days in baseball. They'll never come back. Everything has changed too much, There were a lot of characters in baseball back then, real individualists, not conformists like most ball players and most people all are today. Rube Waddle, for instance, boy, there was one of a kind. They never made another like him. I played on the same team with Rube back in 1899 in Grand Rapids, its club in the Old Western League. We were both just starting out, but it wasn't hard to see and that Rube was going to really be something. He won about 30 games for us that season and hardly lost any. He used to pour ice water on his pitching arm. Yeah, ice water. We'd kid him, tell him he didn't seem to have much on the ball that day and asked him why he couldn't get it over the plate. Listen, he said, I'll show you guys whether I've got anything or not. Fact is, I've got so much speed today, I'll burn up the catcher's glove if I don't let it up a bit. And he got off over to the water barrel. We had a barrel filled with ice water in the dugout and dipped the dipper in and pour ice water all over his left arm and shoulder. That's too slow. Slow me down a little, he'd say. And then he'd go out there and more likely than not, he'd strike out the side. Rube was just a big kid, He pitched one day and we wouldn't see him for 3 or 4 days after. He'd just disappear, go fishing or something, or be off playing ball with a bunch of 12-year-olds in an empty lot somewhere. You couldn't control him because he was just a big kid himself. Baseball was just a game to Rube. We'd have a big game scheduled for a Sunday with posters all over Grand Rapids that the great Rube Waddle was going to pitch that day. Even when he was a big drawing card, Sunday would come and the little park would be packed away before game time. Everybody wanting to see Rube pitch. But half the time it'd be no Rube. Nowhere to be found. The manager would be having a fit. And then just a few minutes before the game time, there'd be a commotion. In the grandstand, you'd hear a bunch of people laughing and yelling, "Here comes Rube! Here comes Rube!" And there he'd come right through the stands. He'd jump down to the field, cut across the infield to the clubhouse, taking off his shirt as he went. In about 3 minutes, he never wore any underwear. He'd run back out in uniform and yell, "All right, let's get 'em." By the end of that season, 1899, we were both in the big leagues, Rube with Louisville, me with Cincinnati. I should say big league because there was only one major league then, the National League. The American League didn't start until a couple of years later in 1901, and it was a few years after that before the National League recognized it. It was sort of like the way it was now in professional baseball. By 1903, we were both in the American League. I jumped to the Detroit Tigers, and Rube went with Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics. We had some great battles after that. The Tigers and the A's, some great fights for the pennant. From 1905 through 1914, either the Tigers or the A's won the pennant every year but two. The White Sox in 1906 and the Red Sox in 1912. But except for those 2 years, we won it in 1907, 1908, and 1909. Connie won it the others. Rube was at his peak those years. He was with Connie. He was amazing. Way over 20 wins every season and always leading the league in strikeouts. How good he'd have been if he'd taken baseball seriously is hard to imagine. Like I say, it was always just a game with Rube. He played because he had fun playing. But as far as he was concerned, it was all the same whether he was playing in the big leagues or with a bunch of kids on a sandlot. The main thing you had to watch out for was not to get him mad. If things were going smoothly and everyone was happy, Rube would be happy too. And he'd just go along sort of half pitching, just fooling around lackadaisical, well. But if you got him mad, he'd really bear down, and then you wouldn't have a chance. Not a chance. Hughie Jennings, I think that's how you say his name, our manager at Detroit, used to go to the dime store and buy little toys like rubber snakes or Jack in the Box. He'd get in the first base coach's box, set them down on the grass, and yell, "Hey, Rube, look!" Rube would look over at the Jack in the Box, popping up and down like a kind of grin, real slow like, yeah, we do everything to get him in a good mood and to distract him from his pitching. When you think about people like Rube Waddle, and there were a lot of other offbeat characters around then, also, you start to get some ideas of how different it all used to be. Baseball players weren't too much accepted in those days either, We were considered pretty crude. Couldn't get into the best hotels and all that. And when we did get into a good hotel, they wouldn't boast about having us. Like, if we went to the hotel dining room, in a good hotel, they'd quick shove us way back in the corner at the very end of the dining room so we wouldn't be too conspicuous. Here come the ball players, and come in the corner, back in the corner we go. I remember once, I think it was in 1903, I was with the Detroit Tigers, and we all went into the dining room of this hotel, I believe in St. Louis. Well, this dining room had a tile floor, made out of tile squares. We sat there way down at the end as usual for about 20 minutes. The tile squares were really the little tile squares. Anyway, for about 20 minutes, we couldn't get any waiters. They wouldn't pay any attention to us at all. I remember a kid, Elberfeld. He was playing shortstop for us then, a tough little guy. Later, he'd play for many years with the Yankees, but on Hilltop anyway, kid, it says, "I'll get you some waiters, fellows." Darn it, if he didn't take one of the plates and sail it way up in the air, and when it came down on the tile floor, it smashed into a million pieces. And that quiet, refined dining room, it sounded like the charge of the Light Brigade. Sure enough, we had 4 or 5 waiters around there in no time. Yeah, Kid was, what a character he was. Kid Gleason was on the Detroit club about then, and too. Another rugged little guy. Do you know that those guys actually tried to get hit with the ball when they were up to bat? They didn't care. They had it down to a fine art. It looked like they were trying to get out of the way, but they'd managed to let the ball just nick them. Anything to get on base, that was all the part of the game then. Kid Gleason used to be on the old Baltimore Oriole team in the 1890s, with Willie Keeler and McGraw and Dan Brothers and Hughie Jennings, who later became our manager at Detroit. That whole crew moved over to Brooklyn later on. I played against those guys when I came up with Cincinnati in 1899. And let me tell you, after you made a trip around the bases against them, you knew you'd been somewhere. They'd trip you, give you the hip, and who knows what else. Boy, it was rough. There were only one umpire in those days, see, and he couldn't be everywhere at once. Ned Hanlon used to manage that Baltimore club, but those old veterans didn't pay any attention to him. Heck, they all knew baseball inside out. You knew ball players were tough in those days, but they were real smart, too. Plenty smart. There's no doubt at all in my mind and that the old-time ball player was smarter than the modern player. No doubt at all. That's what baseball was all about then, a game of strategy and tactics. And if you played it in the big leagues, you had to know how to think and think quick, or you'd be back in the minors before you knew what in the world hit you. Now the game is all different. All power and lively balls and short fences and home runs, but not in the old days. I led the National League in home runs in 1901. And do you know how many I hit? 16. That was a hell of a lot for those days. Tommy Leach led the league the next year with just 6. In 1908, I led the American League with only 7. Do you know the most home run Baker ever hit in one year was 12. That was his best year. 1914, home run Baker, and I tied for the lead with the grand total of 8 each. Now little Albie Pearson will hit that at many accidentally. So you see the game is altogether different from what it was. Then it was strategy and quick thinking, and if you didn't play with your old noodle, you didn't play at all. Like I said, those old Baltimore Orioles teams didn't pay any more attention to Ned Hanlon, their manager, than they did to the bat boy. When I came into the league, that whole bunch had moved over to Brooklyn, and Hanlon was managing them there too. He was a bench manager in civilian clothes. When things would get a little tough in a game, Hanlon would sit there on the bench and wiring his hands and start telling some of them old-timers what to do. They'd look at him and say, "Oh, for Christ's sake, just keep quiet and leave us alone. We'll win this ball game if you only shut up." They would win it too. If there was any way to win, they'd find it. Like wee Willie Keeler, he was really something. That little guy couldn't have been over 5'4", and he only weighed about 140 pounds. But he played in the big leagues for about 20 years and had a lifetime batting average close to 350. Think of that. Just a little tiny guy. Hit him where he ain't, you used to say. Could he ever? He choked up on that bat so far he only used to about half of it. And then he'd just peck out the ball. Just a little snap swing and he'd punch the ball over the infield. You couldn't strike him out either. He always hit the ball somewhere. And could he fly down to first? Willie was really fast. A real nice little guy, too. Very friendly, always laughing and kidding. You know, there were a lot of guys in baseball then. John McGraw was a fine ball player, and he couldn't have been over 5'6" or 7. Tommy Leach with Pittsburgh, he was only 5'6", and he couldn't have weighed over 140. He was a beautiful ball player to watch. And Bobby Lowe, who was the first ball player to hit 4 home runs in one game, he did that in 1894, and that was something. With that old dead ball, Bobby and I played together for 3 or 4 years in Detroit around 1905 or so. Dummy Hoy was even smaller, about 5'5". You remember him, don't you? He died in Cincinnati only a few years ago at the age of 99. Quite a ball player, in my opinion. Dummy Hoy and Tommy Leach should have both be in the Hall of Fame. Do you know how many bases Tommy Hoy stole in his major league career? Over 600. That alone should be enough to put him in the Hall of Fame. We played alongside each other in the outfield with the Cincinnati club in 1902. We had started in the big leagues way back in the 1880s, you know. So he was on his way out then, and I had been up just a few years, but even that late in his career, he was a fine outfielder, a great one too. I'd be a right fielder and he'd be in center, and I'd have to listen to real careful to know whether or not he'd take a fly ball. He couldn't hear, you know, so there wasn't any sense in me yelling at it. or yelling for it. He couldn't talk either, of course, but he'd make a kind of a throaty noise, kind of a little squawk. And when a fly ball came out and I heard this little noise, I knew he was going to take it. Whether or not, we never had any trouble about who was going to take the ball. Did you know that he was the one responsible for the umpires giving hand signals for a ball or a strike? Raising his hand up for a strike, and stuff like that. He'd be up at bat and he couldn't hear and he couldn't talk. So he'd look around at the umpire to see what the pitch was, a ball or a strike. That's where the hand signs for the umpires calling balls and strikes began. That's a fact. Very few people know that. Another interesting thing about Dummy Hoy was the unique doorbell arrangement we had in his house. He had a wife who was deaf, if mute too, and they lived in Cincinnati. Instead of a bell on the door, they rolled down a wooden chute and then fell off onto the floor with a thud. When it hit the floor, they felt the vibrations through their feet and they knew somebody was at the door. I thought that was quite odd and interesting, don't you? It's funny how little things like that come back to you after all those years. That was over 60 years ago when we played together. He was a little fellow, and I said at only 5'5", but he had a real large, strong hands. He used to wear a diamond ring, and we all did in those days. But his knuckles were so big that he had a ring with a hinge on it. A real hinge. He couldn't get a ring that would go over his big knuckles and still fit right. So he had one made with a hinge so that he could put it on and then close it when it would lock in place. Did you know that he once threw 3 men out at the plate in one game? From the outfield, I mean. That was in 1889, and still they don't give him tumble for the Hall of Fame? It's not right. In those days, believe it or not, it was tougher to throw a guy out at home than it is today. That might sound sort of silly, but it's true. Our reason is that the ball was often lopsided. No kidding. We'd play a whole game with the one ball. If it stayed in the park, another reason is that when I broke in the big leagues, we only had one umpire in a game. Not 4 like they have today. And you know that one umpire just can't see everything at once. He'd stand behind the catcher until a man got on base, then he'd move out and call balls and strikes from behind the pitcher. He'd be out there behind the pitcher who'd say a man on second base and the batter would get a hit to right field, while the umpire would be watching the ball on the batter rounding first and trying for second. Meanwhile, the guy who was on second would cut third base wide by 15 feet on his way home. Never came anywhere close to the third base, We'd run with one eye on the ball and the other on the umpire. Did you ever hear of Tim Hurst? He was a famous umpire back then, a real tough character. He was wise to deal with, of course, where the runner doesn't come anywhere close to touching third base. Well, Jack Beckley, who was playing first base for us in Cincinnati in 1899 or 1900 or so, he came sliding into home one day. A real big slide, plenty of dust and all, even though no one was even trying to tag him out. Tim had been watching the play at second all the while. "You're out," says Tim. Jake screamed to high heaven. "What do you mean I'm out?" he roared. "They didn't even make a play on me." "You big SOB, Tim said. "You got there too quick." Yeah, old Tim knew what was going on. I was an umpire too for a while, in the Pacific Coast League from 1935 to 1938. Long after I finished playing, umpiring is a lonesome life. Thankless job. Thankless. You haven't got a friend in the place. Only your partner or that's all. All. He's the only man in the whole place who is for you. Everybody else is just waiting for you to make a mistake. There's a bench over here and a bench over there and thousands of people in the stands. And every eye in the whole damn place is watching like a hawk trying to get something on you. I had a good partner too. I booked in with the fellow named Jack Powell, a wonderful umpire and a wonderful person as well. He'd tell me not to fraternize with the other players. I felt that I could kid around with them a little, What the heck? I had been a ball player myself, but he said, don't do it. Don't fool with the players. Don't have anything to do with them. If you do, sooner or later, they'll put you on the spot. And that's the way they turned it out. He was right. It's a thankless and a lonely way to live, so I quit it. But even then, in the 30s, the game was a lot different from the way it had been played and when I played. The lively ball and the home run were well entrenched by the 30s. Heck, like I said, we played a whole game with one ball. If it stayed in the park, lopsided and black and full of tobacco juice and licorice stains, the pitchers used to have it all their way back then. Spitballs and emery balls and whatnot. But there were some great pitchers in those days. Jack Chesbro and Cy Young, Ed Walsh too. Ed Walsh seemed like I was batting against that guy every other day. Great, big, strong, good-looking fellow. He threw a spitball. I think the ball disintegrated it on the way to the plate, and the catcher put it back together again. I swear, when it hit past the plate, or when it went past the plate, it was just the spit went by. Of course, the greatest of all of them was Walter Johnson. Boy, what a pitcher Walter was. He is the best I ever faced, without a doubt. Did you know that I was playing with Detroit the day Walter Johnson pitched his first Major League game? In his very first, in fact. I beat him, and I'm not being egotistical, but it's a fact. I hit a home run off of him, and we beat him. I believe the score was 3-2 Tigers. I think that was late in 1907. We were after the pennant that year. Our first pennant, we needed that game badly. Big Joe Canlin was managing Washington at the time. Joe. Of him. He was a nice guy. Joe was always kidding. Anyway, before the game, Joe came over to the Detroit bench and said, "Well, boys, got a great big apple knocker. I'm going to pitch against you guys today. Better watch out. He's plenty fast. He's got a Swift." He's told us that, and here comes Walter, just a string of a kid, only about 18 or 19 years old, tall, lanky from Idaho or somewhere, didn't even have a curve, just a fastball. That's all he pitched, just fastballs. He didn't need any curve. We had a terrible time beating him. Late in the game, I hit one. I can remember it as though it was yesterday. It went zooming out over the shortstop's head, and before they could get the ball back, and I legged it all the way around. In those days, the grounds were very big, and if you hit one between the outfielders, you could often make it all the way around the bases. Nowadays, you very seldom see an inside the park home run. They've pulled those fences in, but in those days, most home runs were like that. Yes, Joe was a kidder, but he wasn't kidding that day. That Walter was fast. I batted against him hundreds of times after that, of course, and he never lost that speed. He was the fastest I've ever saw by far. Did you ever see those pitching machines they have? That's what Walter Johnson always reminded me of one of those compressed air pitching machines. It's a peculiar thing. A lot of batters are afraid of those machines because they can gear them up so that the ball comes in where they're just like a bullet. It comes in so fast that when it goes by, it swooshes. You hardly see the ball at all, but you can hear it. Swoosh! And it smacks into the catcher's mitt. Well, that was the kind of ball Walter Johnson pitched. He had such an easy motion, it looked like he was just playing catch. And that's what threw you off. He threw so nice and easy, and then swoosh, and it was by you. Walter was a wonderful person, too, you know. He was always afraid that he might hit somebody with that fastball. A wonderful man in every way, warm and friendly, it wouldn't hurt a soul. Easily the greatest pitcher I ever saw. Of course, I never saw Grover Cleveland Alexander very much, or Christy Mathewson. They're in the National League, and from 1903, I was with Detroit in the American League. I must say, though, that the greatest all-around ball player I ever saw from the National League, I played against him for 4 years with 1899 through 1902. When I was with Cincinnati, he was first with Louisville and then with Pittsburgh. People always ask me about Ty Cobb, you know. You played it in the outfield next to Ty Cobb for all those years. Don't you agree that he was the greatest player who ever lived? Ty was great. There's no doubt about that. One of the greatest, but not the greatest, in my opinion. The greatest all-around player who ever lived was Honus Wagner. Ty Cobb could only play the outfield, and even when his arm wasn't anything extra special. But Honus Wagner could play every position. He could do everything. In fact, when I first played against him, he was as an outfielder, and then became a shortstop or a third baseman, and then later the greatest shortstop of them all. Honus could play any position except pitcher and be easily the best in the league. He got it. He was a wonderful fielder, terrific arm, very quick, and all those place grabbing and sure hits and turning them out into outs. And of course, you know, he led the league in batting average 8 times. You'd never think to hit a look at him, and of course, he looked so awkward, bow-legged, barrel-chested, and about 200 pounds, a big man, and yet he could run like a scared rabbit. He had enormous hands, and when he scooped up the ball at shortstop, he grabbed half the infield with it. But boy, Honus made those plays. He looked awkward doing it, not graceful like Napaloe, but he couldn't make every play Loe could make and more. Talk about speed. That bow-legged guy stole over 700 bases in the 21 years he played in the big leagues. A good team man, and two, in the sweetest position in the world. The greatest ball player who ever lived in my book. Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner met head-on in the 1909 World Series, you know. Detroit against Pittsburgh. We lost in 7 games, the first time the series went the full 7 games. Wagner stole 6 bases in that series, as many as our whole team, and Cobb only had 2. Honus was one of those natural ball players, you know, and what I mean, like Babe Ruth and Willie Mays. Those fellows do everything by pure instinct. Mays is one of those few modern players who are just as good as the best in the old-timers. Although I guess the best center fielder of all time was Tris Speaker. He played in real close, and he could go back and get those balls better than anyone I ever saw. Don't get me wrong, I'm not running Ty Cobb down. He was terrific, no doubt about it. After all, he stole almost 900 bases. He had a batting average of .367 over 24 years in the big leagues. You can't knock that. And I remember one year I hit .378 in 1911, I think it was, and I didn't come anywhere close to to leading the league. Joe Jackson hit .408, and Cobb hit .420. I mean, that's mighty rugged competition. I played in the outfield with Cobb for 13 years from 1905 through 1917. I was usually in right, Cobb in center, and Davy Jones, and then Bobby Veach in left. Davy Jones was the best leadoff man in the league. I've seen a lot of leadoff men, but I never saw one who came close to being Davy's equal. The lineup was Davy Jones, Donnie Bush, Ty Cobb, and Crawford. Although sometimes I batted third and Cobb fourth, Donnie Bush was a superb shortstop and absolutely superb. I think he still holds a lot of records for assists and putouts. They all talk about Cobb playing dirty, trying to spike guys and all. Cobb never tried to spike anybody. The baseline belongs to the runner. If the infielder gets in the way, that's their lookout. Infielders are supposed to watch out and take care of themselves. In those days, if they got in the way, they got nicked. They'd never say anything. They'd just take a chew of tobacco out of their mouth, slap it on the spike wound, and wrap up a handkerchief around it, go right on playing. Never thought any more about it. We had a trainer, but all he ever did was give you a rub down with something we call Go Fast. He'd take a jar of Vaseline and a bottle of Tabasco sauce, how hot that is, mix them together and rub you down with that. Boy, it made you feel like you were on fire. That would really start you sweating. Now, they have medical doctors in whirlpool baths and who knows what else. But Ty was dynamite on those base paths. He really was. Talk about strategy and playing with your head. That was Cobb all the way. It wasn't that he was so fast on his feet. Although he was fast enough, there were others who were faster. Although Clyde Millen, for instance, it was that Cobb was so fast in his thinking. He didn't out-hit the opposition, and he didn't outrun them. He out-thought them. A lot of times Cobb would be on third base, and I'd draw a base on balls. And as I started to go down to first, I'd sort of half glance at Cobb at third. He'd make a slight move that told me he wanted me to keep going. Not to stop at first, but to keep on going to second. Well, I'd trot 2/3 of the way to first, and then suddenly, without warning, I'd speed up and go across first as fast as I could and tear out for second. He's on third. See, they're watching him, and suddenly there I go, and they don't know what the devil to do. If they try to stop me, Cobb will take off for home. Sometimes they'd catch him, and sometimes they'd catch me. Sometimes they wouldn't and get either of us. But most of the time, they were too paralyzed to do anything, and I'd wind up at second on a base on balls. Boy, did that ever create excitement for the crowd, The fans were always wondering what might happen next. Cobb was a great ball player, no doubt about it, but he sure wasn't easy to get along with. He wasn't a friendly, good-natured guy like Wagner was, or Walter Johnson, or Babe Ruth. Did you ever read Cobb's book? He wrote an autobiography, and he spends a lot of time in there telling and how terrible he was treated when he first came up to Detroit as a rookie in 1905. We're almost done, by the way. about we weren't fair to him and how we tried to get at him. But you have to look at the other side, too. We weren't cannibals or heathens. We were all ball players together, trying to get along. Every rookie gets a little hazing, but most of them just take it and laugh. Cobb took it at the wrong way. He came up with an antagonistic attitude, which in his mind turned any little raising into life or death struggle. He always figured everybody was ganging up against him. He came up from the South, and he was still fighting the Civil War. As far as he was concerned, we were all damn Yankees before he even met us. Well, who knows, maybe if he hadn't had the persecution in complex, he never would have been the great ball player he was. He was always trying to prove he was the best on the field and off, and maybe he was at that. One thing that really used to get Ty's goat was when I'd have a good day and he didn't. Oh, would he ever moan then? Walter Johnson and I were good friends, and once in a while Walter would sort of give me a hit or two, just for old time's sake. But when Ty came up there, Walter always bore down all the harder. There was nothing he enjoyed more than fanning Ty Cobb. You see, Walter always liked my model bat. Somehow he got the idea that my bats were lucky for him. So very often when the Senators came to Detroit, Walter would come up into our clubhouse and quietly ask me if I could spare a bat for him. Sure, Walter, I'd say. Go take anyone you want. He'd go over to my locker, then look them over, pick one out, and quietly leave. Well, whenever the occasion arose when it wouldn't affect a game, Walter could let up a bit on me, and I'd have a picnic at the plate, like if Washington had a good lead and it was as late in the game. I'd come up to bat, and Gabby Street, Walter's catcher, would whisper, "Walter likes you today, Sam." That was the cue that the next pitch would be a nice half-speed fastball, so I'd dig in and belt it. Of course, it was a close game. All that was out of the window. The friendship deal was off then. Cobb never did figure out what I did so well against Walter, or why I did so well against Walter, while he couldn't hit him with a 10-foot pole. Well, this is the more I've talked in years, and it's good. I don't see how many people, and even when I do, I don't talk about baseball too much. I read a lot. My favorite writer is Balzac, a wonderful writer, but I rarely talk about baseball. There are very few people around you who remember those old days. Once in a while, I meet some elderly man who says, "I can remember seeing you play. My father took me to see you when I was a kid," but very seldom. It's like when I got elected to the Hall of Fame back in 1957. I was living in a little cabin at the edge of the Mojave Desert near a little town called Pure Blossom. Nobody around there even knew I'd been a ball player. I had never talked about it, so there I was sitting there in that cabin with snow all around. It was February, and all of a sudden the place is surrounded with photographers and newspapermen and radio TV reporters and all. I didn't know what in the world was going on. "You've just been elected to the Hall of Fame," one of them said to me. The people living around there, what a few of them were all excited. They couldn't figure out what was happening, and when they found out what was all about, they couldn't believe it. "Gee, you mean old Sam? He used to be a ball player? We didn't even know." Oh, wait. Sheesh. From then on, of course, I've gotten thousands of letters. I still get a lot, mostly from kids wanting autographs. Sometimes they send a stamped envelope, and sometimes they don't. but I've answered every one by hand. 1957, I was elected to the Hall of Fame. I also went back to Detroit. It was the 50th anniversary to all the players who were still alive who hadn't been who were on the 1907 pennant-winning team. I enjoyed that, but I wouldn't put on a uniform. I went out in civilian clothes, remembered the way I used to be. When they think of Sam Crawford in a Detroit uniform, I want them to think of me the way I was way back then and no other way. Yes, those were the days I'll never forget. There were always a lot of laughs playing ball back then. I guess it must still be the wonderful that way today. A lot of sadness and disappointment too, like losing 3 straight World Series and never winning a pennant after 1909. But always a lot of laughs like ball players and their superstitions. I'm only a little superstitious. I won't walk under a ladder, that's all. But a lot of them were obsessed with that stuff. For instance, butterflies flying across the field, a white butterfly meant something and a red one meant something else. Particularly those big red ones, monarchs they called them, they really meant something. They saw a cross-eyed bat... Wait. Saw a cross-eyed bat boy. Wait. They really meant something special. Hang on. The manager would look out and say, boy, oh boy, there goes a red one. They really believed that stuff, you know. Before Hugh Jennings became the manager of Detroit, that was in 1907, Bill Armour was our manager. He had managed Cleveland before that in 1905. He became the Detroit manager. He'd go nuts. It's if he saw a cross-eyed bat boy. Bill would take one look at him and get an expression on his face like he was about to die. Get rid of him, he'd yell. Or leave him stay, but get him out of my sight. I don't want to see him. Naturally, we spent half of our time searching for cross-eyed kids so we could sneak them in as bat boys. Everything wasn't gay and carefree, of course. In lots of ways, it wasn't the easiest life in the world. We had to travel a lot, you know, and travel conditions were pretty rugged then. We had sleeper trains in the big leagues in 1899 and 1900. When I broke in, but the sleepers and gas lights in them, not electric lights, they used to go around and light up at them at night. We spent a lot of our lives living in of our grips on trains and hotels. The hotels weren't the best in the world, and the trains had coal-burning engines. So you'd wake up in the morning covered with cinders. They had fine little screens on the train windows, but the cinders would still come through. And there were tragedies, you know, like the death of Big Ed Delhanty in the middle of 1903. Ed was only in his mid-30s and was still going strong as an outfielder with Washington when he died. I think Ed was the best right-handed hitter I ever saw. Really a great hitter. It's hard to choose between him and Honus. He was the second man in history to hit 4 home runs in a game. Bobby Lowe did in 1894, and Ed did a couple years later. And then nobody did it again for 50 years or 40 years, whatever. Twice he got 6 hits in a game. Quiet hitter. I think his lifetime batting average was close to 350 as well. Ed was born and raised in Cleveland, the oldest of 6 brothers, and 5 of them became big leaguers. We had one of them, and with the Tigers, Jimmy, a second baseman. Ed's death was tragic. The Washington club was coming back from somewhere, I don't remember or where, and their train had come to the suspension bridge there at the Niagara Falls. It stopped before it went across, and Ed got off for a minute. But the train started up and without him. Ed began to walk across the bridge. The watchman, the guard at the bridge, tried to stop him, and they had a fight or something. Nobody knows what just happened. Anyway, Ed fell off the bridge and was killed. They found his body a couple miles below the falls. It was too bad. He was a nice guy. How did I get started in baseball? Well, I played all the time as a kid, I always loved it. I grew up in Wahoo, Nebraska. There's 2 pages left. Wahoo Sam, I insisted. They put him on the plaque at the Hall of Fame. That's my hometown, and I'm proud of it. Daryl Sanzik came from Wahoo. Did you know that? Also, Howard Hansen of the Eastman Controversy of Music. I remember Daryl Zanzik was a little tow-headed kid running around the streets. His mother and his father owned a hotel there in Wahoo. That was a long time ago. My dad ran a general store, or just a little country store where they sold everything. In those days, baseball was a big thing in those little towns. The kids would be playing ball all the time. Nowadays, basketball and football seem to be as popular among kids as baseball. Maybe more, but not then. Well, as we didn't have radio, or television or automobiles, I guess when you come to think of it, we spent most of our childhood playing baseball. Heck, we used to make our own baseballs. All the kids would gather string and yarn, and we'd get hold of a little rubber ball for the center. Then we'd get our mothers to sew a cover on the ball to hold it all together. We didn't use tape or tape on the outside. And little kids did 10 or 20 years later. We didn't see much tape in those days. 1890 or so. Of course, we had tape then, electrical tape, but not much. I can remember very well the first electric lights in Wahoo on the street corner. Just one loop of wire, they kind of reddish. We used to go down to the corner and watch the lights go on. That was a big deal. And we'd go over to the powerhouse where the dynamos were and see where they made the electricity. After that came to the arc lights with 2 carbons coming together. There was this next step, but the first ones were just one loop of wire in the bulb, and they gave kind of a reddish glow. Of course, there were regular baseballs made back then. We'd call them big league balls, or league balls, but we couldn't afford to buy them, so, and not as kids, that was for the men to play with. For bats, we'd find some broken bat and nail it up for sometimes, and even make our own. Every town had its own town team in those days. I remember when I made my first baseball trip, a bunch of us were from Wahoo. All between 16 and 18 years old made a trip overland in a wagon drawn by a team of horses. One of the boys got his father to let us take the wagon. It was a lumber wagon with 4 wheels, and they used to haul the grain to the elevator and was pulled by a team of 2 horses. It had room to seat all of us. I think there were 11 or 12 of us. And we just started out and went from town to town playing their teams. One of the boys was a cornet player, and we'd come to a town. He'd whip out that cornet and sound off. People would all come out to see what was going on, and we'd announce that we were the Wahoo team, and we were ready for a ball game. Every little town or out there on the prairie had its own ball team and ball grounds, and we'd challenge them all. We didn't have any uniforms or anything, just baseball shoes maybe, but we had a manager. I pitched and played in the outfield both. It wasn't an easy to win those games, so you can imagine. Each of these towns had its own umpire, so you really had to go to win. We played at Fremont and Dodge and West Point and a lot of others in around Nebraska. Challenged them all, did play pretty well too. We were gone 3 or 4 weeks, lived on bread and beef steak and the whole time. We'd take up a collection at the games, pass the hat, and that paid our expenses, or some of them anyway. One of the boys was the cook, but all he could cook was round steak. We'd get 12 pounds for $1 and have a feast. We'd drive along the country roads, and if we came up to a stream, we'd go swimming. If we came to an apple orchard, we'd fill up on apples. We'd sleep anywhere, sometimes in a tent, a lot of times on the ground out in the open. If we were near some fairgrounds, we'd slip in there. If we were near a barn, well, the tour led to my getting started in professional baseball. We beat the West Point team, and after the tour was over, I got a letter from the manager at West Point, Nebraska, asking if I wanted to play with them. He'd say they'd pay me, or at least get me a job. I was to be a barber at the time, so I went up there, and there I met a fellow from Omaha who had been with the Chatham in the Canadian League. His name was Johnny Michaelavin. He was going back the next season and wanted me to go along with them. So Johnny wrote the manager to the chat at them team and told him about me, and they sent back transportation money for both of us. That was in 1899. I was only 19 at the time. Yeah, I was going to be a barber, but then baseball came along, and I never wanted to go back to barbering. I was earning the trade the hard way there in Wahoo. And I do mean the hard way. Cleaning spiders and washing windows and mopping the floor. Then sometimes they'd let me lather somebody and get them ready for the real barber. And sometimes a tramp would come through and want a haircut. I could practice on them, and that's the way we learned in those days. That was a tough way to make a living. Stand on your feet from 7 in the morning to 10 or 7 o'clock at night, or to 10 or 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. Saturday was the biggest haircutting day. All the farmers would come in then. Hay in the hair on all. We used to give a haircut and a shave and a shampoo for 35 cents, 10 cents for a shave, 25 for a haircut, and they'd throw in the shampoo. Now a haircut alone costs $2. Looks like the same old quarter haircut to me. So when I got to the chance to play professional ball, I didn't think about it twice about it. At Chatham, I got $65 a month plus a board, or that was pretty good. $1 was $1 in those days. That Canadian league was just a little 6-club league, folded it up about July from where I was sold to Grand Rapids in the Western League, where I played with Rube Waddle. And in September, they sold me to Cincinnati in the National League. All 3 leagues in 1 year, and I hit over 300 in all of them. So where I was in 1898, touring Nebraska with the Wahoo team in a wagon, and in 1899, playing for the big leagues with the Cincinnati Reds. All right, these are the last few paragraphs here. All that was pretty exciting for a 19-year-old kid. I had never been anywhere before that. At Cincinnati, I made about $150 a month, which was a lot of money in those days, especially for me. There were a lot of old-timers on that Cincinnati club in 1899. Buck Ewing was managing, Biddy McPhee, Tommy Corcoran, Harry Steinfeld, Al Selbach, Jake Beckley, Noodles Hahn, a lot of them. Biddy McPhee played second base for 18 years in Cincinnati, one position from 1882 to 1899. And Noodles Hahn, you never hear his name anymore. He was a first-rate left-hander. Talk about starting and finishing games. That guy had 41 completed games in 1901. Between 1899 and 1904, he started something like 225 games and completed about 210 of them. Well, then in the American League started up about 1901, And the players started jumping back and forth from one league to the other. Larry LaHoie, Elmer Flick jump up from the Phillies to the Cleveland Indians, Ed Alhanty from the Phillies to Washington, Jack Chesbro from the Pirates to the Yankees. They were Highlanders then, and Willie Keeler from Brooklyn to the Yankees as well. I left Cincinnati and went over to Detroit in 1903 and stayed there for 15 years. Boy, here I am still talking. Hard to believe. I hope I haven't said anything I shouldn't have. There are a lot of the old-timers still left. You know, they're liable to say, that fathead, who the hell does he think he is? Anybody popping it off like that? I wouldn't want them to start to say that, because I'd rather they remember me as a pretty straight sort of a guy, you know. So that's when I kick off, they'll say, well, a good old Sam, he was such a bad guy after all. Everything considered, he was a pretty fair square. We'll miss him. That's the way I like it to be.